The juvenile Shra'iken entered Brüks's quarters at 0340 station time, which was how he learned that diplomatic access had been defined differently by each party to the agreement. He woke to the sound of something being set down with excessive precision. His visual cortex assembled the scene in stages. Bioluminescent corridor light bleeding through the open door. A silhouette with too many joints standing at his workbench. Six-fingered hands moving across his belongings with the systematic patience of an inventory algorithm. He did not move. Some older structure in his brainstem had already performed a threat assessment and found the situation not safe, exactly, but not the kind of not safe that required immediate motor output. The Shra'iken was roughly his height and entirely unlike him in every other respect. Her exoskeleton caught the light in segments, each plate a slightly different shade of deep violet gray, the seams between them weeping faint chemical traces that the station's air recyclers were not designed to process. She had 4 optical organs arranged in a horizontal band across the upper portion of her face, each one independently mobile, and all 4 were currently aimed at his cracked coffee mug. He sat up. She did not react to this. "That's," he started. The translator bead in her secondary tympanum rendered a flat declarative into his left ear before he could finish the sentence. The Shra'iken had their own translation infrastructure. They had installed it in their diplomats the way humans installed cochlear implants, permanently, without sentiment about the procedure. "This space is mine now," the bead said. Brüks's prefrontal cortex spent approximately 3 seconds generating responses. His mouth, operating on older instructions, said, "Excuse me?" She turned. All 4 eyes oriented on him with the independent efficiency of a targeting system. She repeated the statement, not louder, not with different inflection. The Shra'iken, he had been briefed, did not use inflection the way humans did. What sounded like flatness was not flatness. It was precision. Every output calibrated to carry exactly the information it was meant to carry, no more. "Territorial imprinting," she said. "It is complete. I have been in this space for 11 of your minutes. The neurochemical bond is established. I've been asleep in this space for 6 years, Brüks said. Your biology does not perform imprinting. She returned her attention to the workbench, picked up his cracked mug, turned it over, set it down in exactly the same orientation, picked up the photograph his daughter at 8, before the accident that had made her into a different kind of daughter, one who called rarely and looked at him like she was trying to remember which parent he had been. Velthara held the photograph at arm's length. All 4 eyes examined it. She put it back. Then she picked up the laminated drawing. It was 11 years old, red and yellow crayon, the lines unsteady with the effort of a 6-year-old who was working hard on a horse and knew she wasn't quite getting the legs right. His daughter had given it to him the week before the accident, and he had laminated it himself on a machine in the station's document center, and he had taped it to the wall of every room he had occupied in the 9 years since. Velthara held it for a long moment. Her sensory array, the cluster of fine chemoreceptive filaments at the base of her throat, was active. He could see the filaments moving in the recycled air. She was reading the object, getting nothing useful from it. The laminate had sealed in whatever organic traces the paper might once have carried. She put it back, exactly where it had been. Brüks got up, walked to the small galley unit, and started making coffee. The crack in his mug ran from handle to rim on the left side, following a geological logic of its own through the glaze. He filled it anyway. Some part of him had already made a decision. His conscious mind was still working out what the decision was. "You want anything?" he asked. Velthara turned from the workbench, all 4 eyes on him again. "I do not require sustenance in your format," she said. "I didn't ask what you required," Brüks said. "I asked what you wanted." A long pause. The translator bead offered nothing. Apparently the concept was processing. "These are different questions," she said finally. "Yes," Brooks said. "They are." He drank his coffee, standing up. She stood across the room from him and processed something he had no instruments to measure. Outside the viewport, the gas giant they were orbiting moved in its enormous, indifferent arc, and the station turned around it, and neither of them said anything for a while. By morning, she had cataloged everything he owned and found all of it defective. The assessment arrived via the diplomatic channel at 0700, formatted in the standard Shra'iken territorial evaluation protocol, and translated by the station systems into something that read like a legal document that had been written by a very intelligent entity with no understanding of human psychology. Which was accurate. It was 47 items, each one listed, each one assessed. Each assessment concluded with the same classification: non-functional, or suboptimal, or repeatedly purpose unclear. The cracked mug. Structural integrity compromised. Continued use presents fluid loss risk. Recommend replacement. The photograph. Two-dimensional representation of absent organism. No survival utility. No communication function. Purpose unclear. The child's drawing. Created by subadult human. Materials degraded despite preservation treatment. Depicts non-specific quadruped with anatomical inaccuracies. Purpose unclear. Brüks read the assessment twice. He was sitting at his workbench with the mug in his hand and the drawing on the wall beside him, and he was aware of a sensation in his chest that a less precise man might have called being known in the wrong direction. At 0730, Velthera arrived again. She had apparently decided the door was a formality that applied to others. "I have questions," she said, "about the subadult quadruped representation." "The drawing," he said. "The drawing," she agreed, trying the word with her mouth, which was not well designed for English consonants and had to approach drawing from an unusual angle. "The subadult who created it. Where are they now?" Brüks looked at the drawing on the wall, the horse with the wrong legs, the careful, unsteady signature in the bottom corner, where his daughter had learned to write her name. "She lives on the third moon of Kepler, 442b, he said, "with her mother. She's 17 now. She paints still. Actually properly. I mean, with real training. She doesn't draw horses anymore." Velthera processed this. "She no longer requires your proximity for development." "No. And yet you preserved this." She moved to stand before the drawing, close enough that the chemoreceptive filaments at her throat were extended toward it, reading its flat surface with the attention of something that genuinely wanted to understand. "You preserve this object that represents a function she has outgrown, under conditions suggesting deliberate effort. You transported it." "Yes." "For what operational purpose?" Brüks set down the mug. He thought about the question seriously, the way Velthera had given it to him, without inflection, without sentiment, as a genuine request for data. "When I look at it," he said, "I feel less alone. That's the function. I know it's not rational. I know she's fine, and I could call her if I needed to hear her voice, and the drawing doesn't do anything that a phone call couldn't do better. But the drawing it's hers from when she was small, and it's here, and I made it last. I made it last on purpose." He paused. "I don't know how to give you a shorter answer than that." Velthera was still for 4 minutes and 17 seconds. He counted because he had learned in 3 weeks of contact sessions that her stillnesses were not inactivity. They were the visible surface of intensive internal processing. "This is not in the xenocultural briefing documents," she said finally. "We don't brief well," Brüks said. "We're not great at explaining ourselves to ourselves, let alone to you. You are saying the object is a prosthetic for the experience of connection." He considered that. "Yes, something like that. A prosthetic functions because the original structure is absent." She turned from the drawing to face him. You preserved an artifact of connection because connection itself is insufficient. Brüks felt something shift under that sentence, the way ground shifts before you're sure it's moving. I'm not sure that's... The original connection exists. She lives. You could establish contact. You maintain the artifact anyway. A pause. You maintain many artifacts. He looked around the room. The mug, the photograph, the drawing. 3 objects chosen over many years to survive every move, every upgrade, every time he'd reduced his belongings to what would fit in a bag. 3 objects that represented nothing useful and whose weight he had carried across 14 star systems. Yeah, he said. I do. Her filaments were moving continuously now, reading the air of the room the way you'd read a text you couldn't quite parse, knowing there was meaning in it, and not yet having the vocabulary for what kind. I need to report this to my analysis team, she said. What will you tell them? She moved toward the door, then stopped, turned back once, briefly, to look at the drawing. I will tell them, she said, that human spaces are not empty between the objects. On the 3rd day, Velterra stopped claiming the room and started asking about it, which was the Shra'iken diplomatic team informed Brüks through 3 increasingly urgent communiques significantly worse. He was drinking coffee when they arrived. 4 elder Shra'iken, their exoskeletons a deeper violet than Velthara's, the plates older and less reflective. The chemical traces they emitted carrying something that his limbic system processed as gravity, even though that wasn't the right word. They were not hostile. They were, he understood, performing a medical intervention on their own juvenile, and the fact that they were doing it in his quarters was a courtesy, or what passed for courtesy, in a species for whom every spatial choice was a territorial communication. Velthara was already there. She was sitting cross-legged on the floor near his workbench, which was not physically natural for a Shra'iken. Their joint structure made it effortful, something you'd do if you were choosing to sit the way a small creature sat, trying the posture on for reasons that had nothing to do with anatomy. The imprinting can be nullified, the eldest elder said, through a more sophisticated translation unit than Velthara's bead, a thing worn like a collar that produced voice with more human texture to it, more inflection, which Brüks found disconcerting rather than reassuring. We will need to remove from this space all objects to which the bond has formed. All of them? Brüks said. The objects that carry density. The elder moved toward the workbench. The photograph, the mug, the drawing, these especially. Velthara, on the floor, said something in unsynthesized Shra'iken. The elder responded. Brüks's translator bead caught approximately half of it. The Shra'iken were not speaking for his benefit, and what he caught was this, that Velthara had not simply imprinted on territory. She had imprinted on what the territory meant, that this had never been recorded, that the mechanism by which it had occurred was not understood, that understanding it was now a secondary priority. The primary priority was reversal. One of the elders reached for the laminated drawing. Velthara's hand came up. Not aggressive, the motion was too controlled for that, the product of a decision, not a reflex, and stopped at the elder's wrist. The elder went still. All 4 of her eyes moved to Velthara's face. Velthara spoke. The elder's translation unit offered Brüks a partial rendering, not that object. A long exchange followed. Brüks sat on the edge of his bunk and watched a juvenile Shra'iken argue with her elders about a drawing of a horse with anatomically incorrect legs, and he was aware, somewhere below the level of language, that something significant was occurring. His amygdala had been signaling him for 3 days about Velthara, and his prefrontal cortex had been overriding the signal as non-actionable, but now they were arriving at the same conclusion from different directions. The elders conferred. Velthara waited, still cross-legged on the floor, her posture communicating something in its chosen discomfort. The eldest turned to Brüks. She has developed what we call contaminated imprinting. the elder said. She has not bonded to your territory. She has bonded to the narrative of it, the why of its objects. This is not how imprinting functions. We do not have a protocol for this. What does it mean for her? Brüks asked. We don't know. It has not occurred before. Brüks looked at Velthara. She was looking at the drawing. Her chemoreceptive filaments extended, reading air that carried nothing the laminate had left behind, reading it anyway. He stood up, walked to the wall, peeled the tape from the drawing's corners carefully, the way he always was with it, as if the laminate might crack if he hurried and took it down. He crossed the room and held it out to Velthara. She looked at it, then at him. The translation bead was quiet. This was not a moment that needed translation. It's yours, he said. I want you to have it. The elder's models, he would learn later, produced no output. The behavior did not parse. Not as a transaction, nothing had been exchanged. Not as a territorial concession, he was giving away something that held value by every measurement they had attempted. Not as communication, there was no category. Velthara took the drawing with both hands, held it against her thorax, the way Shra'iken carry eggs, the way you carry a thing that requires your body's warmth and your attention and the specific pressure of arms held deliberately. She left carrying it that way. The elders followed. At the door, the eldest paused. We will be updating our species-wide assessment of human behavior, she said. What will the assessment say? Brüks asked. A long pause. The chemical traces from the elder's exoskeleton changed, shifted into something his instruments would later identify as a frequency associated with Shra'iken threat response. Not because he was threatening her, because the idea was, it will say, she said, that humans are contagious. She left. Brüks sat in his room, the wall where the drawing had been held, a rectangle of slightly less faded paint, visible only if you knew to look. He picked up his mug, the crack-running rim to handle in the shape of the river, 2 kilometers from the house where he'd grown up, a resemblance he had never mentioned to anyone, because there was no logical reason to mention it. And it still mattered. It still counted. It was still the reason he had never replaced the mug, no matter how many times the crack made it weep a little onto his palm. He drank his coffee. The gas giant turned outside the viewport, and the station turned around it, and somewhere in the diplomatic wing, a Shra'iken juvenile was sitting with a drawing of a horse with anatomically incorrect legs, learning to feel the weight of something she couldn't eat or use or analyze, and finding that the weight was the point.